thanks, especially to our co-sponsors, Department of Hispanic Studies and the program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. Or is it a program or a minor? It's a minor, right?
It's a program.
It's a program, right?
You're the major.
Program director. It's the program director here. So thank you very much for coming and helping to sponsor the talk. Couple events that are coming up. This is one of two colloquia that we'll have this year. And this is a little far out, but on November 14th, which is a Thursday, there'll be a talk by Luke William Hunt from University of Alabama. It's Alabama, Tuscaloosa, yeah. On police interrogation and fraudulent epistemic environments. That's in conjunction with the PPLW senior seminar that Professor DeLong over here is teaching. But it should be a really interesting talk for anybody. So that's coming up on the 14th. On the 23rd, we haven't sent flyers around for this, but this month, October 23rd, we're going to have a sort of pre-registration event and pizza party. If you want to learn about the things that we're offering next semester in philosophy, if you want to meet some philosophy faculty, talk to them about what's going to actually happen in those classes, or if you just want to eat pizza before you leave, then you should come and do that. That will likely be at 4 o'clock on that Wednesday. I'll send you all information about that. If you're not on our Phil Curious mailing list, which just means you might be a philosophy major or minor, but just means also that you're sort of interested in some things that happen in philosophy. If you're not on that mailing list, talk to me or to Priscilla over here, and we will get you on there. Thanks to Priscilla for arranging this room and all the elaborate AV stuff that she's sitting with over there. This is part, oh yes, and then the other thing important thing to announce is that every other Wednesday there's Philosophy Club in the 14 Glebe. This next week, so what day is that? The 9th? Today's the 4th. So yeah, the 2nd, and so it's next Wednesday the 9th. It's 5 p.m., yes, and it will be on the film Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, a discussion, sort of informal discussion of the philosophical implications of that movie. It was Gilmore Girls last week. You already missed it, but you can still watch. Any episodes that you want, any seasons. But you can also watch this film in advance. But they'll be showing some clips. That's what Lily says. That's Lily Kirkland. She's the head of the Philosophy Club. So if you have Philosophy Club questions, go and speak to her. This is part of our Vanished Voices series we've been doing for a couple of years now, and we're quite pleased with. It is quite closely related to the work that Professor Boyle, Deborah Boyle, does on women in early modern philosophy. It's really part of a larger initiative about that I think is going on in the history of philosophy that Professor Boyle has been an important part of basically, just as it says, recovering vanished voices, reading the contributions of people often from groups that we don't associate with being philosophers, the kind of philosophical work they do, not just now, but in the past, throughout the whole history of philosophy, and particularly in the early modern period. So I'm going to ask Professor Boyle to come and introduce our guest for today.
Yeah, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Sofia Ortiz-Hinojosa. She is an expert on the philosophy of Sor Juana. Right now she's working on preparing a volume of translations of various of Sor Juana's works, and that will be published with Hackett Publishing. Right now you're on sabbatical. She's an assistant professor at Vassar College, and she's the recipient of the New Directions Fellowship from the Mellon Foundation, working on a project called Mesoamerican Worldviews, How Indigenous Philosophies Influence Latin America. So I'm really delighted to have her here, so please help me welcome her.
Hello everybody, thanks for joining us on Friday afternoon, and I'm really excited to talk to you about my girl Sor Juana today. She's great, and so hopefully, if nothing else, you'll come out of the talk thinking she's pretty cool. So it's a provocative title. I'll talk a little bit about where it comes from in the talk, but I just want to make sure for anybody that's not taken a philosophy class yet, epistemological is a big word, but it basically just means things having to do with knowledge or with knowing or with grasping something about how the world works. So epistemological, it's Greek for the study of knowledge. So epistemological criminals about knowledge or something like that. Criminals in the study of knowledge. Okay. So So the plan for today's talk, there are 4 sections of the PowerPoint presentation, and I'm letting you know that the one I really want to get to is number 4 here. And I said that this one's short, and so the first 2 I'm going to try to go through at a pretty fast clip, but it's background that I think is important and interesting, and it talks about the scholarship of other people that I respect and admire. So the plan is I'm going to first talk a little bit about the idea of science versus poetry and who has written about science and poetry, basically about knowing and its relationship to poetry in the 17th century specifically. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about this art of equivocation, this tool that I think is especially salient in in poetry for doing philosophical work, let's say. And then I'm going to talk about whether poetry can be philosophical. Hopefully you can tell from the talk that I think that it can, and so I have a little argument for you. And then I'm going to talk about my girl Sor Juana and the way in which she uses this subversive art of equivocation to do some philosophical work. This is just the abstract for the talk that you might have seen on the poster, so I'm not going to read that to you. But, all right, so I'm going to start off by talking about Mary Midgley, who sadly has passed away, but she was a wonderful philosopher in the UK, and she wrote this book called Science and Poetry, where she talks about science and poetry. And she quotes this chemist, his name is Peter Atkins, who described himself as a defender of science and of its, I think this is her term for him, its omnicompetence, its ability to do all the things. So here's Atkins. Although poets may aspire to understanding, their talents are more akin to entertaining self-deception. They may be able to emphasize delights in the world, but they are deluded if they and their admirers believe that their identification of the delights and their use of poignant language are enough for comprehension. Philosophers, too, have contributed to the understanding of the universe little more than poets. Shots fired, okay? While poetry titillates and theology obfuscates, science liberates. Okay, and I just want to point out, this was 1995, so not that long ago, but it's a view that is sort of in the air. It's not just Peter Atkins that has this sort of view, probably. It's just a really quotable passage. So Midgley traces this striking kind of epistemological narrow-mindedness, if you will. She calls it scientific imperialism, to the late 1500s and early 1600s. So I'm just reporting her claims here. So in the Renaissance, they started reading more of these ancient authors, Epicurus and Lucretius. If you've ever heard of them, Lucretius wrote this poem called De Rerum Natura that's basically like making atomism out to be this like really romantic and cool thing. And so in the Renaissance, they sort of reread Lucretius, that he became kind of newly accessible. And a lot of people really liked this poem. And so the idea is they sort of got inspired to think of atomism again as a plausible theory that was exciting and available for explaining the universe because of Lucretius. That's Midgley's idea anyway. And one of the things Lucretius champions is a vision of the cosmos that is explained without reference to God, where pure chance is governing a lot of the motions of the things that are observable. So this excited a lot of the kind of newly, say, quasi-atheist forces, and other things. So people really liked it. And Midgley says an additional impetus was built up after the Royal Society and Francis Bacon's adoption of language describing science as a conquering force over nature. So these sort of biases ironically end up being built against poetry because of a poem. I know, I think it's ridiculous. I think Midgley definitely knows. And I won't be doing exegesis of Bacon because this is not my subject for today, and I know it's a little controversial. Some people don't necessarily think that he was a scientific imperialist or that he talked in misogynistic ways about nature. Here are some quotes that are supposed to sort of show that he was misogynistic and was talking about enchaining nature and all this stuff, and for what it's worth, I just want to point out, like, it's in lots of his books. It wasn't like one metaphor he used one time. It was in many places. So I think the argument's pretty good that he kind of had this vision of science as like this conqueror of nature. But, okay, so Midgley says, highly emotive Baconian hostile imagery about nature was counted as scientific and therefore belonging to the language of reason, while affectionate and respectful imagery, such as Marsilio Ficino used, was dismissed as mere sentiment. And this ruling, this opinion, still exists, she says. Still persists. I'm just pointing out here there are other philosophers who have pointed out this stuff about Bacon. Midgley is not like the first person to think of it, but I'm just using Midgley because she's talking about poetry. Although Midgley celebrates resistance to this sort of imagery by poets, in her book she then mostly kind of jumps to the Romantic period, which is a while later. She draws on like Keats and Shelley and Blake as like people that sort of push against this like reason versus emotion dichotomy and poetry versus science dichotomy. But so I'm going to draw on this other woman scholar, Desiree Hellegers, who wrote this book that I found called Handmaid to Divinity, which is about 17th century poets who she sees as resisting this sort of Baconian narrative about nature. So Hellegers highlights not only Bacon's vision of science as the conqueror of nature, which she sees as linked to his monarchic sympathies and his desire to expand monarchic political control to the sphere of knowledge, but also Bacon's quite specific attitude toward poetry. She says that Bacon viewed metaphorical ambiguity with suspicion and, as Robert Stillman has aptly noted, regarded the poet as an epistemological criminal. There you go, that's where I got my talk title. I was like, this is such a cool phrase. I need to use it. Okay. Here's just some quotes from Bacon about imagination and poetry. Again, I'm not doing exegesis of Bacon. I just want to show my sources. I think here there's some room for interpretation. It's not clear that like Bacon hated poetry. He just didn't know much about it. He had these biases against it. But whatever. We'll use as our scapegoat for now. Hellegers' book argues that several English poets deliberately adopted strategies of resistance against this oppressive vision and its attendant political implications. So one of the things that, again, Hellegers ties Bacon to is this idea that like science was imperialistic. He was a royalist. He was in support of the monarchy, and so he had a certain vision for science that was also political, right? So it wasn't just about knowledge. So she, in her book, she talks about John Donne, John Milton, and Anne Finch, some of whom you might have heard of, not all of whom you might have heard of. Don't worry too much if you haven't heard of them. I'm not going to, again, this is me just drawing on her work. I'm not going to talk about them. But she sort of has arguments for each that they are responding to these narratives through their poetry. Okay. So she talks about how they construct contrasting visions of nature and the cosmos, about God and divinity, about political power and governance, about knowledge and authority, the body and the mind, masculinity and femininity, and the relationship between language, metaphor, and truth. So what she's saying is these poets, in constructing poetic visions, are deliberately pitting these poetic visions against these kind of controlling narratives. And in so doing, it's kind of a resisting motion, right? It's like you're saying, no, it's not true, because look, this could also be true. Plausibly, this could also be a vision of the world, right? That's compatible with what we know. Okay, so one key strategy of resistance that Helleger pulls from these poets that I wish to draw on is the strategy of intentional adoption of metaphorical ambiguity, or the art of equivocation. So the idea is in poetry, you can kind of do things that are not direct statements, right? When you describe things, your descriptions can be ambiguous. Like if you're drawing on an allegory, for example, you're drawing on like a Greek myth, you could just reference the myth, and it's not clear what you want us to take from the myth. Here's one interpretation of this poem, it could mean this. Here's another interpretation of this poem, it could mean this. Which of these is the poet saying, right? There's some ambiguity, there's some equivocation. You can't tell which one the poet really meant. If you're someone like Bacon, who thinks you always have to communicate clearly and directly in order to communicate knowledge, you're sort of losing. You're doing something wrong in the epistemology game, right? Because you haven't told me something true. You've told me something ambiguous, and so I don't know what to do with that, right? But if what you're doing is that you're trying to contest a dominating narrative, right, and you're sort of presenting two alternatives, and it's sort of ambiguous which is true, that can be a move, right, in response to someone that you can't just dethrone by saying you're wrong, right? Like, if they have more power than you, that's not going to work. And so sometimes being ambiguous can be a way of kind of dodging these domineering narratives, right? So it can be a strength to be equivocal. So Hellegers says, it is only logical that some of the most metaphorically complex and ambiguous verse in the history of English literature should have been produced in a period which for many was contingent upon mastering the art of equivocation. A poetics that could embody multiple and conflicting meanings was the ideal discourse for registering resistance. In part 4 of the talk, I'm going to argue that Sor Juana, who was a 17th century poet and philosopher, but she's writing in Mexico City, so she's not in the English literature realm, she's writing in Spanish in a very different context. But I'm going to argue that she adopts very similar strategies for very similar reasons. She's responding to a slightly different kind of political and social environment, but it's for the same reason. Okay, so she chooses poetry as a deliberate medium for specifically philosophical expression. This is the thing I'm going to try to show, is that it's not an accident that she writes poetry in response to certain of these conundrums that she faces. Like, it's not like she's writing poetry because she's not a good essayist or something, or like you couldn't say that in an essay. It's just that for political reasons, the poetry might be the best way of communicating what she wants to say. Okay, so let's do a little bit of philosophical argumentation. Can poetry count as philosophy? Here's some objections that maybe one could think of. And I haven't cited anybody who has these objections, but it's mostly because I'm just trying to create space for the view I'm trying to make. But I'm open to revisiting this if you have your own objections or thoughts. So philosophy requires argumentation, not just presenting a point of view. So this is actually a debate in metaphilosophy. It's about what philosophy is supposed to be. And there's this very strong point of view that some have, that in order for something to count as philosophy, it must make an argument of some sort, right? There's an alternative view that says, well, philosophy is just sort of a world view, something like that. There are philosophers who really hate the philosophy as a world view, because they're like, well, philosophy requires more than just having a vision of things. So there's a debate there. So the objection is coming from the side that thinks philosophy requires argumentation. Here's another kind of objection you could have. Poetry often appeals to emotion, to pathos, while good philosophy usually appeals to your reason, to your logos, right? If you're convincing me because you're emotionally drawing me in, that feels less philosophical, right? That's what advertisements do. That's not what we do with philosophy, right? Maybe that's the kind of thinking you should have in your brain, right? I'm going to call it the anti-pathos objection. Finally, you could think, okay, poetry is too unclear, ambiguous, or equivocal to be good philosophy, for similar reasons to maybe Bacon's, right? Like, we like our writers to be clear and direct, and we sometimes think that they're doing bad philosophy if they're being too obscure. It's like, what are you trying to hide, right? What maybe you didn't think it through so logically, and so you thought you could evade like a careful look, right? And that's what we try to teach our students in our philosophy classes. You gotta catch people when they try to trick you, right? So maybe if it's unclear, it's bad philosophy. So first I'm gonna make some concessions. We are not making the claim that all poetry is philosophical. Privately, I think maybe I could make that claim. I'm kind of curious about that claim, but I'm not gonna make it, okay? That's not, I don't need that to be true. Also, some poetry could be philosophical without meeting all of the methodological ideals of the best philosophy, just as with the majority of philosophical texts, right? When's the last time that you read a philosophy argument where you're like, oh, this is like unimpeachably just logos and perfectly clear and accurate, right? Like, come on, like, no. I mean, if that were true, most of us would be out of a job, I think. And we're not. We're very, very well employed. I mean, there can always be more of us, but we have work. Right? Okay, so now some reasons that poems can definitely be philosophical. So first of all, I think poetry can certainly make arguments, right? If you happen to have taken a course in ancient philosophy that had some pre-Socratic philosophers, you might have read Parmenides. Parmenides wrote a poem that argued that what is cannot be. Basically, some people say the origin of a Greek logic might have started with Parmenides. And he wrote a poem, right? So it provides a globally recognized, logically rigorous, and also a very early example of philosophical poetry. Just like, okay, Parmenides. Secondly, a lot of recognized philosophical writing lacks clear argumentation. Kind of already made that point. But why especially gatekeep against the poets, right? Like, what is it about poetry as a genre that makes us want to close the doors? But like, if an essay is unclear, like maybe it's okay. Also, essays weren't a genre forever. Like, they also originated at a time period, and there was philosophy before that. So I just don't think we should gatekeep on genre. Thirdly, much prose philosophical writing appeals to pathos and not just logos. A lot, like all the strategies of Aristotle's rhetoric are applied in philosophy, whatever the ideals might be, right? Just ask the experimental philosophy people. So the experimental philosophy people have actually gone out and done empirical work on what actually convinces people when you read philosophical arguments, and it turns out it's really, 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 really hard to convince anybody if you try to control or delete all of the emotional appeals from philosophical argument. It's really hard. I think some people have managed to write some arguments that sort of convince people to a significant enough degree that it shows up on experiments without appealing to pathos, but even then, like, how can you be sure that that isn't somewhere in someone's reasoning, right? So most of the arguments that you actually find appealing probably are appealing at least in part for some emotional reason, right? And finally, some pieces of philosophy cannot be read on their own, but require context, right? Sometimes the piece of philosophy needs to be completed by, oh, is this person in conversation with someone, for example? Like, is this a letter where they're replying to something someone else said? You're not always getting the complete argument in that one piece, right? Sometimes it needs to be filled out by the fact that, oh, there's a question and an answer happening, right? If you're just giving the answer and you don't have the question, it doesn't feel like argumentation. It's not a complete statement or something like that, right? And I want to say it's a similar thing in poetry. A poem can be a question or a reply in a philosophical conversation or in a debate, just as well as a letter. And sometimes the recipient can be implied or imaginary, right? There's also philosophical letters that are written to an imaginary human. Like, there's no one there that is the recipient. It's just kind of for the purpose of the rhetorical, right? For framing the genre. Okay. I want you to remember this for Sor Juana later and maybe ask me about it. Okay, so importantly, Hellegers' poets do not conceive of themselves simply as poets. She also gives examples for how each of them self-describes philosophically. And Hellegers says, if for Montaigne philosophy was but sophisticated poetry, Jean Donne, poetry is the highest form of philosophy. And John Milton unequivocally wrote philosophical pieces, such as his epic Paradise Lost, which you might have heard of. Right, and it contains philosophical and theological ideas that he's trying to not merely present, but actually maybe communicate, like push in some way. Some of them are voiced by the characters. The characters wonder about philosophical topics and talk to each other. And then Anne Finch, who some of you might have heard of, maybe, if you've taken certain kinds of English literature classes. While she doesn't self-identify as a philosopher, she does have feminist critiques of masculinist medical scientific discourses. And if you think of feminists as a kind of philosopher, then well, yeah, that counts too. Okay, so Mary Midgley also adds support to the claim that philosophy and poetry have a close relationship. Shelley said that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. What Shelley meant was, of course, that poets, including, of course, imaginative prose writers, are prophets, not in the sense of foretelling things, but of generating forceful visions. They express not just feelings, but crucial ideas in a direct, concentrated form that precedes and makes possible their later articulation by the intellect and their influence on our actions. So it is worth noticing, too, that in this way, philosophy is itself a branch of literature. Any major kind of philosophizing always presents some distinctive ideal for life as well as for thought, because life and thought are not really separate at all. So I quite like this fact that philosophy is a branch of literature. I remember when I read it, because I was like surprised by it almost. It's almost like I hadn't considered it too seriously before. And I was like, wow, it's so obvious, and yet we don't think about philosophy that way that often. Okay, so now I'm going to get to talk about Sor Juana, and hopefully I can do this section in 15 minutes. This is part of her portrait, and this bit that I cut out is actually from, she used to be on the 200 peso bill in Mexico, and now she's on the 100 peso bill, so she's still on the money, she's just on a different denomination, but she's really, really well known where I'm from, in Mexico. You get taught her poetry in high school, usually. But she's just not as well known outside of Mexico. So I'm going to try to make a case that she's a philosopher. And in case you haven't heard of her before, here's just a little précis on her life, a little biography. And I'll try to be quick because I can talk about her forever. But she was a criolla nun, so basically descended from Spanish parents, but born in New Spain. So that was a class called the criollos. And she was cloistered in a Hieronymite convent in Mexico City. That was then New Spain. So now it's Mexico. At the time, it was part of the Spanish Empire. She won admiration in the viceregal court as a teenager for her erudition. So she sort of astonished people with how intelligent she was. And the story goes, I don't think it's apocryphal because it was mentioned at her death. They sat her at a table with like a bunch of basically college professors, and each of them got to ask her a question. Allegedly, there were 40 of them, and apparently she impressed all 40 of them. This was probably when she was around 16, 17 years old. So she was crazy smart, and she self-taught because women were not allowed to go to school when she was alive. One of the viceroyals, specifically one of the vicereigns, became her patroness and helped her publish some of her work. She tells us that she became a nun because she wanted to study, not get married. It's not like she didn't have offers. She was a good-looking woman, but she didn't think she had prospects enough, or maybe she just didn't want the married life, so she professed for a nun so that she could spend time writing. She complains that even then she didn't have enough time to write because life is pretty busy as a nun. And her writing courted controversy largely actually because she was a woman writer and less because of the content of what she wrote, although there is a little bit of the content part. In one letter, she argued that women should be allowed to teach other women and in this way not be kept from an education. So she was a feminist, or some people call her a proto-feminist, which is, anyway. She was also an accountant, a composer, a logician, and a competent cook and a decent seamstress. She was good at many things. And she did write, unfortunately we've lost them, she wrote a treatise on accounting, a treatise on music theory, and a treatise on logic, all of which were probably very small, but they haven't survived. A polemic late in her short life, which was a friend of hers asked her to write down a conversation they had had where she had criticized a sermon by a popular preacher, and so she wrote her criticism down. It's very thorough, it's really incisive, and he published it without her permission. And that caused an uproar because, A, popular preacher, she's criticizing him. She's a woman. He's like, big dude. Also, apparently, he was a favorite preacher of the Archbishop of Mexico. And lastly, it involved theological argumentation. And if there's one thing that you know about religious life, especially in the 17th century, you don't write about theology if you're a woman, especially in the Counter-Reformation. Okay, the Inquisition is going to come after you. There were threats of that floated. they didn't actually come after her, but she was forced to give up her studying and her writing. She had to sell all her books, so it was quite tragic. But she's a great read if you ever want to read Sor Juana. She's really funny, she's witty, she's sarcastic, she's very self-aware. She also knows multiple languages, so sometimes you see other languages in her poetry. Okay. So, although much of Sor Juana's obra is worth discussing in the context of the art of equivocation, I'm just going to focus on First Dream, which is this massive poem that I'm in the process of translating. And my contention is that Sor Juana deliberately adopts the poetic form to address questions which, due to their controversial or complex nature, could not be treated by her straightforwardly. Because of her social location as a woman, a nun, a criolla, and someone who was already the target of scrutiny. If you're a famous woman in the 17th century, you kind of have a target on your back. Josefina Ludmer has described rhetorical moves similar to these that equivocate between saying and not saying and knowing and not knowing, in Sor Juana's work as tricks of the weak. All right, so First Dream. This is a wonderful illustration that sort of paints some of the images in the poem. So first of all, I should say a little bit about the poem. So narratively, the poem is a description of nighttime first. So the beginning of the poem describes kind of the cone of night rising in the sky, and then all of these animals kind of falling asleep. And then eventually, it's quite complicated, it's a very Baroque poem. Eventually, we move to a sleeping body, and the motions of this body as it is asleep are described, like the motions of the different organs. And then the soul separates from the body in the dream, the soul of this person, who we find out at the very end of the poem is a woman. But anyway, the soul rises and it wants to ascend to the highest part of the cosmos that it can get to in order to be able to see all of creation. So basically, it wants to know everything, right? And as it tries to do this, it ascends and it fails. It's sort of overwhelmed by the number of things that are before it. It can't comprehend it all, and then it falls back down. And then there's a bit of the poem where the soul is kind of rallying to try to figure out, okay, can I try again? How am I going to do this? There's mention of Aristotle and his 10 categories. It's a very philosophical poem. And then there's kind of a moment at the end, which is going to be the subject of part of my interpretation here. I'm going to try to figure out what's happening in this part of the poem. The soul is sort of trying to goad itself on to like make a second attempt. And there is literary disagreement about the meaning of the poem. Like, does this protagonist actually succeed in the second pursuit of knowledge? Has it found the right method for knowing? Or does it not know? Does it end in skepticism, right? So basically, like, illumination versus skepticism, which is it? And it's hard for people to tell when they read the poem which of the two it is, and it seems like a pretty important problem, but it is actually perfect for what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so I'm going to start at the beginning. There's some early examples of metaphorical ambiguity that are really beautiful. So Night is a character in the poem who's described as a woman. And it's unclear, like, whether Night is this, like, protective and benign being, right? Protective because it sort of allows the soul of freedom to go and pursue this thing, this desire to know everything. Or is it, like, a dangerous and subversive thing? At the end of the poem, Night is chased away by the sun, who's, like, this righteous, like, man with his army, and she, like, runs off with her skirts, with all her, like, dark night monsters running with her. Then she runs to the other side of the earth to try again on the other side of the earth. It's a very cute image. Right, but like, which of these is it? Is she both? Is she a bad guy or a good guy? I don't know. And then there's another figure near the beginning of the poem. Who's here, Nectimene, who's from Greek myth. If you've ever read Ovid or something. She was a woman who was turned into an owl because she had sex with her father. Typically, the implication in the Greek myth is that, like, she did this on purpose or something. But if you read this with any kind of feminist lens, you're like, there's no way, right? She was wronged, right? And the figure is ambiguous in Sor Juana, so she's described as like, she names this owl, Nictimony, who's flying into a church to seek refuge, and then she drinks from the olive oil in the sacred lanterns. And she points out that olive oil comes from Minerva's tree, so the olive was Minerva's tree. So she's drinking from the source of knowledge, right? She's seeking wisdom. She's seeking wisdom hiding in a church, right? Like, isn't that a sympathetic image? Right, so is she a maligned heroine or a pitiable monster, right? Which thing? And then she also describes these three sisters that were turned into bats by the god Bacchus because they didn't go to his festival because they were home working, and he turned their whole house into like basically a forest, and he turned them into bats, right? And so there's all these women that from the Metamorphoses that have been turned into monsters, and you're like, are they really monsters in this poem? I mean, they are described monstrously, but there's some ambiguity. You can read it as like, these are bad or these are good. There's a side note here about Conway, because she talks about the inherent transmutability of creatures, and I was like, I wonder if Conway was also reading Ovid. Anyway. Some further binaries that are explored and I suggest undermined in the poem. So Sor Juana does a lot of like contrasting opposites, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly. And part of what seems to be happening is that she's pointing out that the opposites aren't like incompatible. Sometimes they're complementary, or sometimes you need both for things to work. So light and shadow, day and night, rising and falling, the sky and the earth, like those are opposites, but they're also not opposites because they're both in nature, right? And I won't go through all of them, but you can see from this list, I think she does this a lot. The poem is a long poem, so there's room for a lot of these. And in fact, I think one of the ones she's playing with is the dichotomy between natural philosophy and poetry and metaphor. I'm going to give you an example of that in a moment. Okay, so here is an example of two things that seem to be opposite, and she's pointing out that they're not. Okay, so this is the point in the poem where the soul has been overwhelmed and it's fallen and is trying to get itself back together. She describes it as kind of like a shipwreck. The soul has been shipwrecked. And so now it's like trying to recover. Okay, so, but like someone who subjected to prolonged darkness all at once is assaulted by the great luminance of the revealed colors of objects and made more sightless by the excess, then appeals to the same darkness before a dismal impediment to sight, right? Using their hand over and over to block the rippling rays from their weak bedazzled eyes. The shadow now, a merciful mediator, serving as an instrument so that they might recover, rehabilitated in increments. So she's talking about how like, even the light is like this good thing that helps you see. If there's too much of it, it's overwhelming, right? And it's like, if you've been in a dark room and you come outside, it's like, you know. And so she's talking about how you need the shadow to help you see. You need both the light and the shadow. And then she describes basically this section here that I'm quoting from. She's talking about Galenic medicine. So that out of a deadly toxin, by scrupulous regulation of its hidden noxious qualities in well-apportioned quantities, one could make a gainful concoction, that utmost fixation of Apollonian science, an admirable theoriac that demonstrates that perhaps from bad, good can be created. So a theoriac was this like old remedy that had like a bunch of stuff in it, some of which was like from poisonous creatures. And the idea was if you had enough of this stuff mixed in the right way, right, if you're the right kind of alchemist or whatever, it would cure maladies. So like to cure snake poisoning or something, they might use a theoriac. But it was made in part from poisonous objects. So the idea is that just because it appears on the bad side of the dichotomy doesn't mean that it's just going to be bad forever. You can use it also, as long as it's about proportion, right? It's about complement. Okay, so now let's turn to the ending. Okay, I have like 3 minutes, so I'm going to go a little bit over. So the interpretation has launched myriad manuscripts in especially Hispanic literature departments. But anyway, but also philosophers. So she talks about, now the soul is like wanting to move up the hierarchy of being. It wants to think about things in an ordered way. My understanding wanted to follow the method for the series above, that is to go from the beings ranking lowest, the inanimate, which in its vegetable spirit is for Themis, her firstborn, although crude, the first one fed from her fertile maternal breast. So she's saying she wants to start with like the lowest types of beings, according to like Aristotle's De Anima. Those are the vegetable spirit ones, so minerals and plants. Yeah.
So like as like the lowest types of beings, you mean like from the very start, like right when the baby like comes?
Well, so not from the very start developmentally, although that is a really good question.
Okay.
She's talking about
She said in order, correct? Like everyone's the same
Mm-hmm.
in a sense, but
Well, so she's talking about a hierarchy of souls. So like in Aristotle's system, there's like rational beings at the top, and then there's like animal souls that have the ability to move and perceive, but they don't have reason. And then at the bottom, there's like plants. So what she's saying earlier in the poem, it's a little bit clearer. She's talking about how she's going to try to order her understanding. So she's not going to try to do everything all at once, but she's going to try to kind of like organize it so that it makes it easier. So she's saying here that she wants to start with the lowest. So she's going to start at the bottom and work her way up. And
it's
the bottom
funny that
is
she
like
organizes
plants.
plants at the bottom, even though that's how we live.
Yeah,
It's like breathing.
that's right. And I'm glad that you said that because because I'm going to give you an example in a moment that's more or less going to agree with you. I think that she has a similar thought and a similar criticism of Aristotle. At times then, she wanted to investigate these levels, but other times she desisted, judging it a boldness and excess to reason through all of it when she did not understand yet even the smallest, even the simplest part of these natural effects, which were easiest to access. So she's like, okay, I have an organized system, I'm going to try to follow it. And she's like, wait, how am I supposed to do this when I understand nothing yet? Like, I don't know anything yet. How can I, move on with this, like, Aristotle's organon, which is this huge system. So I don't know if I have time to read you this whole select. I'm going to do it. I'm going to be selfish, okay? So she's talking about a rose in this part of the poem. She doesn't call it a rose, but here to tell you, I spent a long time with the poem. It's a rose, okay. She did not know yet why the fragile beauty of the fleeting flower is outlined by a figure of ivory, and why her colors are mixed together, reds muddled among the white aurora, each to her fragrantly complementary. Why she exhales ambergris perfumery and shows the winds vestments that are gauzy yet magnificent, as she in one in another propagates fresh daughters, the rose hips, which she fabricates in ruffled bubbles edged with golden curls. And when the mantle's white seal is broken, the sweet womb of the Cypriot goddess, open ostentatiously, flaunts its treasure. So she's describing the rose's reproductive life. So it's this beautiful object. She's like, I don't understand even like flowers, these beautiful, wondrous things. They've got so many amazing qualities. They like reproduce. Like, I don't even understand that. How am I supposed to get all the way up to like all of creation when I don't even get this, which is supposed to be really simple, right? And she goes on, and I wish I could read all of it, but the idea is here at the end she has a metaphor too. She's like, roses are beautiful. Like they're also used in cosmetics, and the cosmetics at the time were poisonous. So she was talking about female vanity, like a good poet. Okay. So the poem goes on. For if even one lone object, timid thought repeated, makes the knowing faculty flee and derails cowardly discursive inquiry, if the understanding has to retreat before even species in segregation, taken independently from adjacents, considered as if without relation. Here she's just doing the Aristotelian, you're supposed to do each object independently. And astonished discursive reason spooks at the difficult examination it is refusing to face valiantly because it fears it might cowardly comprehend poorly or never or late. How could discourse ever encompass such a fearful machine of such vastness, of such terrible unyielding weight? What was counterbalance enough for the sphere? How could this machine be judged less ponderous, less heavy than the task of investigating nature? So she's like, all right, I had a method, the Aristotelian method. It's like right there. but it just seems too big. She seems cowed, right? And the thing that cows her is the flower. All right, so what are we going to do with this? So let me suggest the following interpretive points. What do roses represent? The list is a very long list. You probably are thinking of some things that roses represent to you, right? Could be a metaphor for natural processes themselves, like the process of reproduction, or for purity. She mentions kind of the whiteness of the rose. For femininity, for beauty, for divinity, because roses were also very strongly associated with the Virgin Mary, who Sor Juana is a fan of. For fertility, for vanity, right, because they're using cosmetics. For ephemerality, because they don't live very long. For fragility. So all these things. Which of those things does Sor Juana mean when she uses this metaphor of the flower? She's not answering that question. The poem isn't answering that question. I mean, it feels like it is, because it's right there. The image is presented before you. It's like tantalizing you, right? It was driving me crazy when I was like, what does she mean? She's got to mean something. And then I realized, well, whatever metaphor applies, the upshot is that the task of understanding whatever that is, like a rose, is not separable from the task of understanding everything. Because the rose has everything. It has all of these things that are a part of nature. Beauty is a part of nature. Fragility is a part of nature. Femininity is a part of nature. Do you think Aristotle had a grasp of femininity? Like, no. And the scholastics certainly didn't either, right? They didn't have a perfect grasp of divinity either. These are all things that are supposed to be really hard to understand. So, So I think the text is deliberately ambiguous. I think that that's what she's doing as a poet. She's being a poet. She's pointing out something that poets are really good at pointing out. It's almost a trope, right? That like this insufficiency of science, right? Well, there's certain things that it can't know or something, or that it doesn't consider enough. So I don't have time to talk about this at length, but right after this passage, she does something that's very curious, and that still puzzles me. She talks about the example of Phaeton, who was also a figure from Greek myth, who's the son of the god of the sun, Helios, or Apollo, depending what you read. And he demanded to drive his father's chariot. He demanded to drive the chariot of the sun, and everyone's like, oh, this is a really bad idea. You're a mortal kid, like you can't do that. And so he does, and it ends terribly. The earth gets like burnt up. He ends up getting killed by Zeus's thunderbolt because the horses go crazy. He can't handle them. It's all terrible, right? So it's a tragedy. But she talks about Phaeton in a way that sounds like she's inspired. So she considers it, and it's like this idea has gotten into my head, and now that I know that it exists, it can't get out of my head. Wouldn't it have been better not to know about the crime that was committed at all? Like, they shouldn't publish crimes when people commit them, because now you know that they've been committed, and like now that you know it's possible, or something like that. That seems to be the implication around when she's talking about Phaeton, which is really curious, because again, his life ended in tragedy, right? He doesn't seem like a model or an exemplar to follow. So the protagonist of the poem seems to weigh a desire to pursue knowledge against the risk of pursuing knowledge. And there's also interpretive controversy about which meaning we're supposed to take from this, right? Is this a caution? Don't do it. Don't pursue knowledge because it'll end in fiery death and you'll hurt other people. Or is it like, ooh, but it's possible though. You can drive the chariot of the sun. Like, let's dream big, right? Like, who cares how short our life is going to be? This is worth it, right? Unclear. How can that, that's a big ambiguity. Like, that's a big swing. Which of those two things is it? And I can't tell you for sure. So, what do we say about the protagonist of the poem and where we end on knowledge? I was trying to contrast, this is an image of Phaeton driving, or Helios driving the chariot of the sun. And this is actually an image of Elijah, who, funnily enough, in the Book of Kings, he's also carried into heaven by a chariot of fire. So I'm like, maybe she was thinking of that. Anyway, my contention is that Sor Juana is deliberately equivocating. She's using metaphors that invite ambiguous readings, and that is a feature, not a bug. That doesn't detract from her philosophical content. It actually kind of enhances the philosophical content. She also chooses the medium of poetry as a deliberate philosophical vehicle for expressing resistance against a patriarchal and oppressive order that wanted to restrict her access to education, to books, and to writing, that saw women as ignorant, vain, and full of original sin, that often saw nature as to be conquered, dominated, and exploited, like women, and also as separate from divinity, inert or machine-like, and knowable by masculine reason alone. Right, remember, the protagonist in this poem turns out to be a woman, and she's the one who's engaged in the pursuit of knowledge. Her metamorphosed, shadowy women are sympathetic, not fully good or evil. Like the protagonist, they are not the true opposites of daytime or of goodness or of reason. They are maligned, but they persist. And just if anyone wants to know, these images are by Casanova. He's got some cool. They're ink. They're real ink that he dotted on water.
Do you want to take your own questions?
Sure. Yeah. Feel free to call back to anything or ask questions about stuff I didn't talk about. If you want to look at something.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful. I just want to ask about the potential elephant in the room.
Yeah.
Plato's Republic, Book 10.
Uh-huh.
So I'm wondering if the long-standing prejudice against poetry counting as something philosophical may just be based on taking Plato too seriously or literally when he thought that we should kick out the poets out of the city. Because pre-Plato, poetry was philosophy. Aristotle, just after Plato, took poetry philosophically. Lucretius, it goes on, right? So it's not like we've just waited until the 17th century to start, or 16th century with Bacon asking about whether poetry was welcome to philosophy. It's long-standing prejudice. Yeah. The irony being that Plato's dialogues are just full of metaphors and myth and fable, and themselves are a beautiful kind of poetry. Bacon himself used a lot of metaphors. I'm just wondering if anybody, like Plato himself, Bacon himself, ever took that idea that poetry was not philosophy seriously.
So many thoughts. So this is an excellent, a very expansive question. I don't want to do Plato exegesis.
No,
that's going to
let's
get me in
not
trouble.
do that.
But I do want to say that there are questions with both authors, with both Plato and Bacon, what exactly their view was about poetry and how badly they were down on poetry. And even Bacon at one point, I think I have a quote from him. He's like, "Oh well, this kind of poetry isn't that kind. It's not so bad." He's talking about proverbs, like proverbial poetry. He thinks is okay. The other ones are bad. So the poetry that's supposed to inspire you to be ethical, that's okay. So in that way, he almost seems kind of like Neoplatonic. So yeah, I think this is a long-standing bias. I don't think that it started in the Renaissance or anything, or post-Renaissance. And I also think it's based in a sham. they're all self-undermining as soon as they make that claim. But I think that it's due in part to a kind of manner of dichotomous thinking, maybe, where certain forms of expression are associated with certain cognitive states. This was certainly the case with Bacon. I have cited someone who talks about that. But in Bacon, so usually it'd be imagination as a faculty is associated with things like fiction, whereas reason as a faculty is associated with prose and these other rhetorical styles. And so they just kind of go together, and so their natural form excludes this kind, and that's why we're suspicious. There's something about Plato also talks about images suspiciously, and he talks about shadows suspiciously. All of these kind of lesser forms that aren't the true forms. You can't access them with sense perception, right? There's also that bias against sensation. So I think it just kind of systemically, if you take those kinds of views, because Plato wasn't the only one, they end up resulting in this bias against poetry. And it's not clear that way of cutting up things makes sense, but anyway, I think that's really the core motivating reason, is because there's a kind of splitting up of the responsibilities of.
Surely she was aware of Plato's approach to poetry. So do you
Oh,
think
yeah.
that part of her subversion had to do with that?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, because even like that image where she's talking about shadow and light.
Yeah.
I think that looks exactly like the point about exiting the cave, right? It's like, oh, you're blinded by the light.
Yeah.
And she's making this point about how you need the shadow to recover. Like, I don't know if she's responding directly to Plato. I don't know whether that's what she had in mind, but it's sort of hard to remove it from your mind once you have it there, and it just feels like such an excellent kickback. Like,
Yeah.
did you really think through, Plato? Just, she's sassy, yeah.
So I loved your presentation. I'm in Hispanic Studies and one of the professors that works on Sor Juana and other novels. But
yay.
so I've never really thought about it so much from this philosophical angle. So it's really wonderful to hear these arguments, and I really enjoyed that. What about the whole? Because I taught the poem, but it's been a while. Honestly, I should have reread it for this talk, but. I think a lot of Hispanic studies scholars, like you referred to, they really like to talk about how the poem is about gender, and how at the end her soul wakes up and it doesn't have a gender. Does that go into your philosophical arguments?
Yeah, so wait, you should tell me a little more. You say that she wakes up and it doesn't have a gender?
Yeah, it's sort of like the very last bit.
Well, so I thought it was the other way around, because el alma, right, is
Yeah.
gender neutral, and so
Yes.
for most of the poem, the soul is gender
Yeah.
neutral.
Right, you're right.
Yeah.
You're
I
right.
think
So
I think I understand what you're saying,
right,
but
you're right. I
it's
got
the
it.
flip.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
and then at the end she wakes up and it's feminine.
Yeah, yo
correct?
despierta.
Yes.
Yeah, she says, and I
Yes.
awake, like I a
Thank
woman.
you for reminding me.
Yeah, that's right.
I knew I had it not 100%.
Yeah.
So it's gender neutral, the soul, and then at the end she wakes up as a woman. So does that play into your philosophical arguments here?
Yeah, so I think it does. I have other work where I talk about Sor Juana on the soul, because she also has like a short poem where she describes herself as her soul is neutral. She thinks souls don't have a gender.
Yeah.
Like bodies have a gender, souls don't have a gender. I think that's probably something that's a popular thing to talk about in Hispanic studies departments too, where part of the freedom of the soul escaping the body is maybe it's free from these like shackles of the patriarchy, right? Like, and yeah, I think that there is that subversive element. At the same time, because gender is everywhere in the poem, all these characters are women. Not all of them, but like most of them. It's kind of curious when she decides to include a character that's not a woman, because not all the animals are women. But yeah, in terms of what I think about it, in terms of her philosophical system, so it's kind of a Platonic element in her work. Going back to Plato, in that Plato also talks about souls as gender neutral in a sense, like at the end of your life, according to the myth in the Republic, you can choose kind of your next body if you've been virtuous, and it's not clear that there is a division between like the men's souls and the women's souls. You just sort of go into whatever realm, and so he also has like a defense of women's potential for intellectual, virtue, and so it's possible that is part and parcel of the same thing. She might like Plato for those aspects. The thing that's hard to state is like, to what degree are these metaphors not mere metaphors, right? To what degree is it a statement of her actual philosophical views? I think that it's likely that the gender-neutral soul one is closer to her actual philosophical views, because she says it in another place, and it seems to align with other things she says. And I think that it's maybe one of the rare instances where there's not as much ambiguity in the poem. I mean, she's so definitive at the end that the soul is waking up as a woman. That one is almost tempted to see the soul throughout as gendered, right? It's almost tempted, except that it would be going against what she says somewhere else. Yeah, I don't know, did that kind of answer your
Yeah,
question?
no, it's just, yeah, it's interesting, because I hadn't thought from this angle from philosophy before, so.
Yeah. Thank you.
Could you explain the equivocation argument or whatever that means? There's something about like
Uh-huh.
making a point that's like entirely too ambiguous or having or being like super direct and clear and concise.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, so I think I went over that a little quickly. So, the implicit idea of the, like, say, anti-poetry crowd seems to be that if you want to do good philosophy, you have to communicate clearly. And that's what I tell my students in all my philosophy classes and for my philosophy papers. You probably have heard similar, right? We're not going to be excited if you turn in, like, a poem instead of an essay if you ask for an essay. But the idea is that sometimes if you're in a situation where it's dangerous or bad to state what you actually think, it can be helpful to have a cover so that someone can't tell exactly what you mean, right? Or so that different people will read it different ways. So there's all kinds of rhetorical moves like this, but the idea is that equivocating is one of those kind of shields for communicating. Wish I had a concrete example right at the tip of my tongue, but I don't know, like suppose like a friend asks you, like, do you want to go out tomorrow night? And you're like, oh, maybe. Like, that's not an equivocal answer because you're not literally reading that two ways, but it leaves open either the yes or the no, which is why it's frustrating. If a friend tells you maybe, you're like, oh, come on, just like, I need to make plans. Tell me yes or no, commit. And insofar as you equivocate, like, you're making it unclear which of the two you're putting forward, and so maybe someone will hear it how they want to hear it. And that'll give you some cover, or it gives you plausible deniability if someone says, oh, this is what you thought, and you're like, no, I didn't say that. I said this other thing that could mean the opposite of what you thought I said, right? That's the art of equivocation. And so the theory is that with these authors like Anne Finch or Sor Juana, like, if they're trying to communicate their true views in an environment that wouldn't accept their views, if you kind of mask them using metaphor and ambiguity and allegory and all these things, and it's like really hard to penetrate into what you actually said. You said what you wanted to say, but not everybody's going to be able to accuse you of it, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I think I kind of want to follow up on that
Sure.
a little bit. So the way you just spun that story out, it sounds like if the author is in this sort of difficult external position where there are these pressures that are making it hard to tell what they really believe, right? They're sort of they're endangered in some respect, right? I guess I'm wondering if there aren't such forces, then what's the value in the equivocation? So I guess I'm wanting to hear more about
I
that
see.
part of your story, right? I see that it has this particular value, and I'm trying to understand when there aren't those pressures, it seems like you still think the poetic form can do important things for us philosophically, and I'm wanting you to elaborate on
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's interesting. I wasn't thinking about that side of it directly, but yeah, I think that that's right. So, on the one hand, I mean, I think there can be poetic reasons for doing things that are purely aesthetic.
Sure.
I mean, poetry is an aesthetic medium. You just do things because it's beautiful. A lot of people do, not because it like does anything practically. But yeah, I think in practical terms, and I'm not going to be the best writer on this. I think there are other people who maybe talk about it better. But I think that poetry has the ability to do certain things that you can't do in prose. And insofar as doing those things maybe helps you make a philosophical point, you could choose to do that deliberately to make the philosophical point. Maybe you're not always doing that, right? Sometimes poets will just use those tools because you can. But like one thing, for example, that's true about poetry is that like, I don't know if this is exactly accurate to say, but like time works differently in a poem. I think it like people in the literature departments also talk about this with novels. Like I sat in on a literature class recently, and I thought it was kind of funny how they were talking about the novel because the novel is a paradox, is what they were saying. Because like the novel can present different narrators that contradict each other, and go back in time and forward in time and jump around and like what makes it cohesive, like because it's not linear, right? It can be non-linear, it can be in multiple perspectives at once, and so that's a prose form, but it's something about the fictional genre that it's in. And I think poetry is similar, like when you juxtapose one line that says one thing with another line that says another thing. It's clear in some of Sor Juana's other poetry, not so much, or it's less obvious in Primero Sueño, but one of Sor Juana's favorite moves in poetry, she's a master at it, is that she will, I don't know, like, I'm going to try to remember off the top of my head. En perseguirme el mundo, en que te ofendo, cuando solo intento poner bellezas en mi entendimiento y no mi entendimiento en las bellezas. So she has this poem that's like, in persecuting me world, like, how do I offend you? I'm only trying to put objects of beauty in my mind and not my mind on objects of beauty. So that thing that she did is basically she used like the same three words, but like now they're in a different order, and because they're in a different order, they have a different meaning. And they're like side by side, right? And she's rhyming them. So they fit together, and she's doing this conceptual play where she's flipping ideas on their head. And it's something that I think is especially possible to do in a poem because of that rhythmic invitation or something, because that conceptual ordering is so clear. And she has like over a dozen poems where she does this. She was a master of that. And I suppose you could say in those poems too, she's like making a philosophical point. It's a point about value. It's a point about you're valuing things in this way, but here I'm taking the same elements, sort of, or so it seems, like right, like syntactically or something, and I'm flipping them, and now you have a different thing, and that's what I want, right? It's more of a rhetorical move, I think, but I don't know how you would do that quite as easily in prose, or at least it doesn't occur to one naturally to think that's a way to talk. Yeah, I don't know how helpful that was, but I hope it was something.
Do you think that ambiguity is also used to kind of communicate an idea about philosophy to begin with? Right? That there isn't like one clear answer for something to begin with. And also if she has like the way that she writes, it kind of makes you want to like really break it down. But when you read something that's like really plain, simple, like this is the first premise, this is the second premise, this is where I got, it's easy to reject that argument. Because you're like, well, if I just don't believe this small part, right?
Mm-hmm.
But, which ideally all philosophers would be doing this, where you'd be really, trying to like figure out exactly why they're making this point. With something like this, it's like entrancing, like you really want to know what she's trying to say, and then in the process of figuring out what she's trying to say, even if you don't agree, like, it's just something really, you like pull something more out of it than something that's super direct and just is what it is.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think like the invitation to interpret is part of what's fun, right, for reading works like this. It's like, oh, does she mean this? Ooh, that's kind of cool. If she meant this, what would that mean? And then you just sort of draw out the consequences on your own. You're like doing the other part of the work, right? And then you realize, oh, maybe that's not the only thing she means. Maybe she means this other thing. And like, which of those two strategies is more successful? Maybe they're both successful. Ooh, what does that mean if they're both successful and they're compatible with our interpretation of the poem? Maybe the poem has not just one true meaning or something. And then I don't know what you do as an epistemologist. Right? But I think, yeah, that's absolutely right. I think that it's a way of kind of rejecting one manner of thinking about how to communicate fact, if you will. Where this is one of the freedoms of literature, maybe, that conflicting interpretations don't conflict exactly. Like some of them do, but they can be complementary. Right? And then what happens if you say, well, maybe they meant all of them, or maybe they meant none of them, or maybe they hadn't thought of some of them and you thought of them. Are they there or not, right? Is this Sor Juana or is it not Sor Juana? Like all these things that I'm interpreting from her might not have actually been what she meant. But if I present them to you as one of the options and you find it compelling, then that's a point that we can make. either about her or someone else. I don't know, but I think it's true. Yeah, and I don't mean it's like it's the only true one or something. I don't know. Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could talk more about the idea or the context of the dream in particular as a way of doing philosophy, or philosophy as poetry.
Yeah.
You would obviously think it's like, well, this is the opposite of what we need for philosophy according to that sort of stereotypical way.
Yeah.
But of course, there's Descartes, right, obviously, where the idea that we might be dreaming is supposed to be destabilizing for our understanding, but actually turns out not to be at all, because almost immediately it turns out that, like, well, we'll just focus on the building blocks of the things that we experience in the dream, and we'll concentrate them on kind of as ideas, whether they represent physical reality or not, and that actually turns out to be a really good way of doing philosophy
Mm-hmm.
in the meditation. So I assume something like this at a very different level is happening here, like the context of the dream is a really good context for doing philosophy or philosophy as poetry in this way.
Yeah.
So can you just like expand on that story and
Yeah,
as Sor
absolutely.
Juana would tell it?
And it's not an accident in her. She talks about the imagination. So one of the things she talks about with the sleeping body that moves into the soul, she talks about how the vapors move from the stomach and like then they nutrify the brain or whatever. And then she talks about like memory feeding into imagination and blah, blah, blah. And so one of the metaphors she uses before the soul rises is that she describes there being something like a sea that is mirror-like and undisturbed, and the vapors move up in such a way that they do not disturb the clear vision of the understanding. So what she's saying is this is a dream, but it is a rational dream.
Right.
It's not one of those crazy ones. So she's saying like the surface is clear. We are not getting our vapors mixed up. It's not like Aristotle has a bad case. One of the things he says is that like women aren't rational because our menstruation messes with our rationality because of the movement of the blood or whatever, right? And the vapors can mess with you and whatever, these different theories. And she's very much stating, insofar as she can state anything in the poem, that those are not happening here. So this is a rational dream, and so the projections that are put forward by Fantasia then are sort of a clear and distinct concepts.
That's pretty close to Descartes.
She's pretty close, but I'm not positive that she read Descartes, but it's just so close that it's like, I spent a lot of time with that part. But yeah, she's basically saying that this is a dream, but that doesn't mean that it is the opposite of reason.
Well, maybe it's sort of the opposite of that, right? It kind of is a dream of reason. So that's
So if you do read it as like a juxtaposition of Descartes, for example, that's the part of the, ooh, but what if it's a conversation, right? Like what if we imagine that Descartes is the person she's talking to? It's sort of implicitly kind of a critique of some ways of interpreting that, the like idea that dreams are like hallucinations or something, that they're misleading. The sense perception doesn't tell you things are true. At the same time, I think, and I'm not the only one to say this, the thing that's unique about this poem that she's very aware of, I have a whole paper where I talk about this, but I don't want to go on too long. She is in the realm of the conceptual, of the pure conceptual in most of the second half of the poem. So she's talking about intelligible objects, not sensible objects. She's using metaphors of sensation, but usually when she does use metaphors of sensation, she's careful to talk about sensations of negatives. So sensations of negation. So like she talks about shadows. Those are what is seen. Or like mirrors or things like that. Or the whole poem takes place in silence. So what you hear in the poem is silence. So, right, and so the idea is like when you get to the conceptual, it's all kind of, one of these commentators describes it as a poem in black and white. Because even though she talks about all the visible colors, like right when she's talking about the flower is one of the first times that you get actual mentions of colors in the poem. But we're in this rational moment, and so probably what we're talking about is her concept of flowers. She's remembering a flower or something. It's not like...
experience.
Yeah, so it is in a dream, but it's in a dream as if you were in, and she talks about this too, she talks about how the soul moves into the highest part of itself and seems to almost come out of itself because of how high up it is. So this is her way of trying to say that we're working with nous and not like some of the other lower faculties of, right? So she's like, it's nous that is doing this thinking, we're doing the thinking with the understanding, and then the things that come before us are now concepts. Okay. So it's a dream, but it's like, it's not, or
It's
something.
good.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, I think we're